right, good morning, everybody. Both of those of you that are in person and joining us virtually, thank you so much for attending today's virtual workshop. It is entitled Sankofa on the Brazos, Researching African-American Families in Washington County. Today's webinar will teach the basics of African-American genealogical research for all of you aspiring family historians. There is a handout that I will be adding to the chat box shortly that you can use to follow along for the presentation. If at any time you have questions, please insert them in the Q&A section of the Zoom section, and we may also have some questions from our live audience as well. Our presentation today will be led by Ms. Dolores Butler Rogers. Ms. Rogers is a member of the Willie Gay H-Town chapter of Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. The mission of the Willie Gay H-Town chapter is to nurture the interest and collaboration of genealogical and family history research with emphasis on people of African descent, as well as preserving the local history and cultural heritage of people of African descent in the state of Texas. They have recently conducted research on 6 local Washington County families that will be featured today during our Juneteenth celebration on site. We are so excited to have Ms. Rogers sharing her knowledge with us today. So I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And thank you for everyone here who has joined this webinar to learn a little bit more about how to find our ancestors. And one of the things that I always tell people when you're searching for your ancestors with African-American roots, sometimes people say that's almost impossible to do, especially going past 1870. The last census that recorded the names of African-American ancestors. But, you know, as Marcus Garvey said, a people without knowledge of their past history and origin and culture is like a tree without roots. And it is possible to research your family beyond the 1870 census. I want to thank all of the researchers and Mr. Jesse Williams for their work in this project, because one thing about research is collaboration is so important. So if you're trying to research your families, remember that you need to collaborate with family members and others who are doing research. This wouldn't be possible without collaboration. Finding your ancestors, you know, it's a journey. It is not, it's a journey that for me, finding one of my goals in researching my ancestry was to find my my 3rd great grandmother. And that had always been a desire of mine because my family had so many pictures of her, and I wanted to know who she was and a little bit more about her. Well, it's a journey, and it's been a journey of 30 years before I was able to determine her full name. So it's always a journey. It's, you know, so you have to think about there are going to be successes along the way and some setbacks too. But what I've learned is you have to leverage what you know. You know, think about your traditions. Think about the traditions of your families. All of those have some connection to your ancestors. You know, I tell people, one of the things I enjoyed was interviewing my grandfather many years ago. When I was right out of college, I developed this fascination with researching ancestry. And I had an opportunity to interview my grandfather. And you need to interview your oldest relatives. And what I mean by interview is collect things that are precious to them. And stories and family stories, and you know, those storytelling times when people are talking about family, remember that. And take on the challenge of becoming a family historian. You know, think about that. Identify yourself as a family historian, and then begin to develop the skills. And like this workshop, hopefully will give you some tips on how to begin that journey. One of the things, I love so much is one example of interviews of your oldest relatives is there are so many resources out there on families. And this is what is called the slave narratives. It's remembering slavery and how these interviewers from the government went across the country interviewing people right after slavery. Well, think about now, we just came out of a pandemic. Interview the people and find out in your family how they survived it, what were the challenges and that kind of thing, because you now are the ancestors that your daughters, sons, grandchildren, and the next generation will be trying to research. So involve your family in research. It's always important to keep them at the center of your research. This is a picture of my husband's family and our family and their reunion. Leverage those family reunions that you have. Collect those memories. Those memories are so important to you understanding the past. Now, once you've actually focused on your family, because a lot of knowledge is right there in your home, in your attics, in your closets, in those suitcases that you put away, there is a lot of family history there that many times we throw away. And then there's always that family member who has all of those funeral programs, all of those, that is a wealth of knowledge that we should all try to leverage. The other thing is, when you're on this journey to find out who your family is, you have to understand where they live, the environment they lived in. So study a little bit about the environment. Learn what was around them during the time period that you're trying to research. Understand their past. Identify the plantations. Many times we drive down roads, we cross over streets, and there's history everywhere around you. And normally you can find it if you're looking for it. So identify those plantations, those townhomes, those freedom colonies. Texas had quite a few freedom colonies in the state. So did your family live in any of those communities? Investigate that. The other thing is cemeteries. Some people call cemeteries spiritual towns, and these are the towns where the saints live, individuals who have gone on, and many of our family members are there. And normally they're living next door to each other. They've been planted next door to each other. So identify those cemeteries and where your ancestors might have been buried. And I think by taking a visit there, I remember going to a cemetery in Opelousas, Louisiana, because one side of my family is from Opelousas, and visiting the cemetery. And lo and behold, what did I find? I found right next door to one of my ancestors, my fourth great grandfather. So visit those cemeteries. They have a wealth of history. Locate those community religious places. Many times they have answers to where your ancestors were, where they stepped, what their footprints were in your community, and you can find them there. The other thing is leverage those, Jesse mentioned earlier, leverage those genealogy groups in your community, because many times they have researched your family. So check those out, explore what knowledge they have, and in terms of your search, because they can save you time. Things that you've been trying to research and figure out, they may be able to give you a quick tip on how to move forward in your research. Also, study migration patterns. Did your family migrate from the south to the north, or did they migrate to the west? What were the patterns of your particular community, and how were they migrating over time? Know a little bit about the community. You got to understand the history of the country that you're in and the community that you're in. That includes understanding a little bit about US history and what happened. And so for this particular area, you see in 1528, African enslaved people arrived in Spanish Texas. Everybody didn't go to Virginia. While a lot of us did, land in Virginia, many of us in Texas came with what was called the Spanish Texas area. And so learning a little bit more about the history of the area will give you perspective. Study maps. I love maps because I'm a visual person, and maps just help me understand how things, actually happen. This map shows those states that were slave states, those that were free states, those that were free territories, not a part of the United States in 1861. And there are all kinds of maps on there. I say, Google is your friend, really, and just use that to figure out, look at the landscape around you. Learn a little bit about your state and what was going on in that particular state. Also, I would say, African Americans arrived with the first European explorers into Texas. And so many of them landed, of course, the oldest, Esteban, landed on Galveston Island and was enslaved by Native Americans in our country. But just learn a little bit about the history of your state. And then finally, I say there's so much rich history in Washington County. Learn about Washington County. Sometimes I when have friends that come into town and they say, what should I go to see? Do I know enough about my city to be able to tell them about the facts of that city? So learn a little bit about the county that you live in, how it was organized, when it started. I mean, Washington County started before Texas was a state. So, just look in terms of that. And there are a lot of wonderful online free resources, birth certificates, death certificates. When we researched these 6 families in Washington County, one of the things was that we were going to only use public records to identify information about families. And so you're so blessed to have so many records available. There are land and probate court records that are available in your community. Learn a little bit about that. The other thing is identify your neighbors. Who were your neighbors? Because neighbors were normally, in many times, family. So think about your neighbors, any associates, and any friends. So when you're looking at documents, don't just look at your ancestor. Open your mind. Don't just focus on that one ancestor, because many times the people who are living next door are related or living down the road. Try to educate yourself a little bit about some of the terms that were used, because we have all kinds of terms for identifying people of color with African descent. And there were many terms in the past to identify people of color with African descent. So learn a little bit about those terms and what those terms mean. The other thing is, be sure that you focus in on the first names of your ancestors first, especially if you're going back before 1870, because many times we did not have a surname. So sometimes that becomes, people just started selecting their own surnames. So you need to be open to a surname, and even surnames, the variation in surnames. So this is an example of the Shake Snyder family. And this particular surname, do you see how many different variations in that spelling are found in documents? But all of these individuals are related to each other. All of them have some connection to the original Sheikh Snyder that came to the United States. So, although they may have many variations, it's all the same family. So if you think your name is spelled a certain way, think about how it might have been misspelled in records. Think about how it may be a little different. You know, in my husband's family, for instance, Rogers is spelled two ways, with a D and without a D, but it's the same family. So think about that when you're researching. You're going to find nicknames, you're going to find variations in the spellings of those names, especially in documents. And notoriously, I know in my family, we have people with all kinds of nicknames, and people don't find out until they show up at their going away service and they say, who is that? Who is that person? And that person, you call the nickname so many times. And think about it, even in documents, you're going to find sometimes the nickname is used instead of the real government name of the individual. So be open to that. And then sometimes we have the challenge of just the handwriting that is in all of those documents. So seek help in translating the information on these documents. I work with a genealogy group, and they're basically millennials. And so they don't know how to read cursive writing. So seek help. Don't be afraid to get help. Do not be afraid to get help in translating documents. I have even put passages that I didn't understand on Facebook and said, okay, can anybody read this? And so you get multiple versions and eventually you get the right translation. So remember that. And then we have, let's see, I need to go back. And then we have things that can help you. And I believe in free things. If you're starting out, don't buy these expensive subscriptions and that kind of thing until you learn more about how to navigate these. Probably the number one search engine for researching families is Ancestry, but there are many others. Family Search is a free site. It was started long before Ancestry came along, and there are documents that you can research free. There are websites that point you to that. The one thing that I would say that people really overlook is their local libraries. You know, the local public library in your area is a wealth of information. The largest genealogical library in Texas right now is the Clayton Library in Houston, Texas. You can access their resources online. You don't have to pay for it. If you're a citizen of Texas, you have free access to that library, and that library is all about genealogy. So find your local public library. It's free, and you can access information about your family. You'd be surprised how many gems are in those libraries and how those librarians can really help you. So I'm a champion of librarians. The other thing is, as you start this journey of trying to trace those footsteps, don't be discouraged. It's a challenge, but it is not a roadblock. You can get around it and you can find those ancestors. So there are some basic things you need to be ready to do. Everybody cannot do a pedigree chart. Everybody cannot do a family group chart. And these charts just document who your relatives are. Start with what you know. Put in those charts what you know. All of these charts are online. They're free. I go back to Google. All you have to do is write in family tree template and one will come up. And so use those. Don't be afraid to use those templates. One of the things I tell people who are beginning in genealogy is, can you identify your great-grandparents? So take some time, if you don't know who your great-grandparents are, to talk with family members to see if you actually know the names of your grandparents. And so you see, you have 8 great-grandparents. And so there are 8 surnames that are connected to every family. You won't be able to research all of those surnames at once. I've been working on genealogy since the 70s, and I have not fully researched all of the surnames in my family. You just have to focus on one at a time, just one at a time. And here's a basic family tree. Fill in what you know. That's what I say, start with what you know. So fill in those names that you actually know. Here's a family group chart. One year with my family, I gave each family member, the head of each family, a chart and said, would you complete the chart? This is just a basic chart that starts with them, tells who their children are and who their spouses are. And that can be the start of your journey in trying to locate an ancestor. The one thing that I made a mistake at when I first started researching is I did not do a research log. And what I mean by research log is document all of your finds. When you find information that is helpful for you to research your family, document it. Where did you find it? When did you find it? And who was it about? And the reason some people say, oh, this is going to be too much. It's just going to be too much. It's going to save you tremendous time. Because I remember going over the same document several times and then by the end of the document, I said, oh, I found this document 4 years ago. But if I had put it in my research log, I wouldn't have gone back to that same source. So document a research log. It would have saved me, I think, years in my research had I started out using a research log. Now, the one thing that one of my relatives told me when I was researching, I kept finding all these people who married multiple times, or they married in the same, brothers and sisters married, in the same family and that kind of thing. And she said to me, look, the buggy don't go that far. So, look around you, look around you. People married who was close by. And, families were formed with people who were close by. I had one relative that said, I have identified, I believe, a second family to your ancestors. And they said, oh, no, that's not possible. My great-great-grandfather did not have another wife at the same time. So look around you. So in that area was a river. She said he couldn't have walked that far. He couldn't have gotten on, trying to think it through. He couldn't have walked that far. But at the end of the day, there was a river. He could have just gotten on up and, down the river. So if it's down the river, think about it. The buggy don't go that far. Okay? So remember that. The other thing is you got to understand maps. I love maps. You got to understand the counties around that. Maps change over time. They do not stay the same. I understand Washington County used to be 10 different counties. It turned into 10 different counties. It started out as 1 and turned into 10. Think about how when you're looking at documents, that can become quite confusing. So think about that. Look at a map and make sure you are identifying the right area of your ancestor in all of these documents. I've said before, remember the migration patterns. So you want to know who your people are, and Where are you at in researching for your people? You know, remember those neighbors and friends. Make sure you focus on that. Make sure you establish a fact by at least 2 different documents. And what I mean by that is there can be conflicting information in documents, and there can be mistakes. It all depends on when that information was taken and by whom it was given. There are so many instances, and we found some in Washington County, in which instead of the person documenting their parents on a death certificate, the parents of the deceased person on the death certificate, they put down their own parents. The informer put down his own parents. Misunderstandings about how to complete documents, all of those can result in mistakes on certain documents. So that's why it's always good to find a secondary source, not just one source, because sometimes there can be mistakes. As I said, create those, those original documents are documents of eyewitnesses. That meant it was done at the time and it was done by the person who would have been an eyewitness. Secondary documents are created later. A death certificate is a secondary document for the deceased person because they're not there. Now, a birth document that a parent done, you might consider that as a primary document. That's really not the most important thing, whether it's a primary or secondary document. What is important is that you establish at least 2 documents that can support your conclusions in your search for your ancestor. Here, I'm going to go over some basic documents. And so for you researching your family, there are some vital statistics. There are things that will help you if you're looking. I say the Civil War is the dividing thing. There's post-Civil War and pre-Civil War. So after 1865, what you have is you have the US Census. And then there are local census records. In Texas, in the beginning of the founding of Texas, there are some state census records. Then you have what you call the Freedom Bureau records. Those were records that were taken by the Freedom Bureau offices that were established all over the South. And that's where people went to file claims. They kept their bank accounts were at these offices, and also labor contracts were there. And then there are those things where people were declared free. Those documents, those exist. There are deeds and wills. There are military service records. I think military service records are some of the richest records for information about your ancestor. There are school records that you can access. There's the voters registration. I am so inspired when I look at 2 years right out of emancipation, people were going to vote, and they declared their citizenship by voting in the 1867 census, and some states have 1866. Social Security applications. Social Security applications also have a wealth of information. So that's after 1865. If you're lucky to get back to 1865 in identifying an ancestor, there are those records before. And normally those records before take a lot of experience sometimes in evaluating it, and you will develop those skills over time. But I can tell you about those records. It's not for the faint at heart, because you have to literally go through. A lot of these records aren't indexed. So that means you have to look at document after document after document. And so those documents, as you learn more and you become more skilled, you will find those documents very helpful. One of the things, along with a cousin of mine, that she just discovered was the actual will of the enslaver for one of my ancestors. And so literally it is 63 pages long, and it has list of enslaved people, but it's also in that cursive writing. And so it's going to take a group of us to actually go through that document. So there are ways to find your ancestors before 1865. And so I've given you some hints on where you can look for those documents. The 1870 census, this is the census that reflects the names of Blacks for the first time. That was the first time our full names appeared in a census. Otherwise, before 1870, you would only find them in like wills and successions and some other documents. So keep that in mind. Here's an example of a death certificate. And death certificates contain all kind of information. You can find the marital status, occupation, the parent's name. And then to me, one of the most important things is that informant's name, because normally the informant is a close relative. It's normally not a stranger. Now, sometimes it might be a medical doctor. It might be, a practicing physician in the area, but most of the time it's a relative. So focus in on that person, because you may have to use that person to find your ancestor. The other piece of information that I like to focus on, most people focus on death, birth, marital status, they ignore everything else. But don't forget that address. Where was that relative living? And when you can find out where that relative is living, it opens up a lot of avenues for you. You can also look in other documents. You have this person, you think they're a relative, but you're not quite sure. But lo and behold, looking at the residence, you find out they were living at the same address. So that makes that connection. You have, as a genealogist or a family historian, you have to have a quest for information, and you have to keep asking questions. But these documents do help you. Census records. That's also another wealth of information for you. In these census records, you can find out everybody living in the household. You can find out what they were doing, their occupation. You can find out where their parents lived before, so you find out your parents lived in Texas, in Washington County, but their parents were from Georgia, South Carolina. That gives you hints and clues on where to search for your ancestor. Even in this particular census, you find that it even tells you whether that person voted in that year. So you get a wealth of information in census records. The other area where you can find information is called information wanted notices. And so some of these date back to 1863, right at the signing of the Emancipation, when people were just searching for their ancestors and that had been separated during slavery. And here is one in which, this person says, I wish to inquire some of my relatives, my sister, my brother. My sister and I belong to the estate, and, they tell the name of the estate person, and that my sister was sent either to Houston or Galveston. So in all of the newspapers in the areas, people were putting these ads in newspapers, many of them African-American newspapers. These newspaper ads are online. You can access them. Just Google information wanted notices. And when you go through those notices, you can find out a lot of information. You can find out where they live. Sometimes you can find out if they changed their surnames, because many times people just took on new surnames, especially right out of slavery. They just took on different surnames. Many times it even tells you how many times a person was sold during slavery. So it gives you information about their migration and what happened there. This one said, I left my mother in Culpeper County, 3 miles from Chancellorsville, Virginia. She was sold by John Thomas to James Russell. At the same time, I was sold by the same man to John Decker. So now that gives you clues, that gives you hints for searching for an ancestor. And so many times, a number of them, that's how they finally ended up in Texas. You can help figure out, how did that person end up in Texas? Because many of us didn't start in Texas. Our ancestors didn't start in this particular state. Here is one in Brenham County. I desire to find my husband's relatives. His father was Sam Reynolds, mother Matilda, and sister Emma, a brother Gates Rivals. I left them during the war at Marion Perry County, Alabama. And then it goes on to say, mother and I went to Galveston the first year of the war, but my mother went back and left me. What a wealth of information that would help you locate your relatives. And it would also open up your mind, because many people, when they're researching for the first time, they want to stick just to Washington County. But there are so many connections outside of Washington County and outside of Texas and outside of the South that you may miss by just concentrating on that. So those are documented. The other thing is, everybody knows that family member that has all of the funeral programs. And maybe, if you're a family historian, you're going to be that person. You're going to collect those programs and you're going to use that information to help build your family's history. Because our family history, many times, I think a lot of funeral programs began to be very elaborate in the 1960s, and many of us could not afford to put those in newspapers. And so our funeral programs contain, they contain the parents' name, the children, the cousins, the friends. It's just a wealth of information, and certainly you can find the basic information in there. And don't forget these obituaries. Remember those. A common practice, the obituaries were a common practice after the 1900s, but as I said, many of those you do not find for African Americans, but there are some there that you can find. The other thing is, here is pretty much information about this particular person in Washington County. You could see the full name of the person, their birth date, their parents, the death date, any organizations they were in. Because people belonging to organizations, you can find out a whole lot about their life and what they did at a particular time. Military service, education, and spouses you can normally find in some of these obituaries. Search for your ancestors in military records. As I said, those are the richest records, those pension files. If you can get your hand on a pension file, the family that I was researching, the pension file, some pension files you write off for, they may contain maybe 5 documents or so. The family I researched in Washington County, there were 63 pages of information to look at on that particular family. I know the National Archives are only taking appointments online right now, but hopefully if you ever can get, if you had an ancestor that served in the military, try to get that pension file. It has a wealth of information for you. normally the surnames. My father-in-law, he would always say, I asked him, I said, what was your grandmother's name? He said, I don't really remember. We just called her grandmother. We just called her grandmother. So I made my mission to try to find that name, and it was in a pension file. So just think about that. You find your family, as I said, in religious, documents. You use in runaway ads, you find them. So think about those. Here's an ad in which the person was looking for a particular individual, and it gives their name. It actually happens to be in a county real close to here, Grimes. Check out those local city directories. Those local city directories also have, remember those addresses that you saw in the death notices and other areas, that can help you find individuals. And as I said, research those Freedom Bureau records. They're so important. Now, the next thing I want to talk to you about is something that people that I find when they're starting their research, they just don't want to do when they're starting their research for their African-American ancestors. You just got to explore the white ties. You cannot ignore them. They may or may not be family, but you do have to research those families. And many times those families have very extensive genealogy and family histories online. So Google that family. And many times you might even find that lists your ancestors in there. So, research those families. Don't shy away from that research. Like I said, research that slaveholder, because basically they list their property, and their property is listed in detail many times. And so you may find your relative there. Here's an example of one where at the death of that person, and just pray, that in God's divine wisdom, that they died before 1865, because after 1865, the names are not listed in wills. But before that, you can normally find names in wills. So if you can identify that person, you may be able to locate your ancestor. And sometimes there are freedom papers that are around. And so those freedom papers, pretty much people would, in their wills, say, upon my death, Sally will be free. Or 10 years after my death, John will be free. And you may be able to find an ancestor that way. Then there are insurance policies. So part of the whole slavery period and all of that was that people did take out insurance policy on their cargo. And so basically there are records of that with and online too, and free, remember free. All of these states, there are insurance companies that have those records. And so you may be able to find an ancestor that way. Go to these local places right here in your own county. Research those places. And they can help you with your research. In Houston, we have the Buffalo Soldiers Museum. If you want to understand the Civil War and what went on and how it went on and what were some of the things that were happening during that time, go to your museums. That's what they're there for. They can help you. They are a resource in helping you locate your ancestor. As I said, some essential places for finding your ancestors, your courthouses. Washington County has online free access to birth records, many of them dating back to the early 1800s. Cemeteries, visit your relatives and mosey on along through that spiritual place and you might find an ancestor. Some people talk to their ancestors. I have a cousin, she likes to go at night and set up her some wine and a table and talk to her ancestors to bring them back. That's not me though. You won't catch me there. But the cemeteries are like little cities and towns. Visit them if you're looking for an ancestor. Your libraries, your universities. Right here in Texas, Stephen F. Austin, right now it has a slavery project going on in which they are putting up all of the wills and the succession papers of people of the 300 families of Texas and of others. And there is almost every day, there's new information being added that can help you in your search for an ancestor. You know, one of the things that my husband's aunt really loves is she loves searching for family on the internet. Now, that's not my generation, but the generation after, to a couple of generations after me, I must say, they love social media. And so many times they're posting their grandmother's picture there for you. They're telling you her birthday. They're posting any other information they may have. They're telling you about their children. You learn their birth dates. Social media can help you find an ancestor. And if you find an ancestor or you find a person who is a relative, they may have the answer for you. So don't ignore those. Grow your tree because it is a minefield of information, as I said. You know, and then look for those holidays because that's really when you get a lot of information about relatives. On Mother's Day, everybody posts a picture of their mother and says, Happy Mother's Day. Those birthday celebrations, ancestries, all those throwback days that they have on social media. And if you don't understand what I'm talking about, I know, check with a grandchild, check with, if you don't have a grandchild, check with your neighbor's child, but they will be able to help you navigate social media to find those ancestors. And of course, there's the web, Google, family search. Start with family search, it's free. There's a site called Find a Grave, and that really lists all of the graves. Not all of the graves, but a lot of graves there are pictures taken of it. Sometimes people put biographies there. That's great. Chronicling America. That's where you can access all of those old newspapers I talked about if you're looking for an ancestor or you're trying to find an ancestor. And then there is the Portal to Texas History. And that's part of the Texas Historic Commission site. And on that site, you can search for all kinds of information regarding not just Texas history, but individuals who came here and in the early part of Texas, even up to today. Sometimes you might even find a historical marker with your family or your ancestor's name on it. So use these websites, they're free. Then there are, as I said, the Freedmen's Bureau, digital libraries, all kinds of resources that you can use to research your family. One of the things, there is what's called Fold 3, and that's a site for military records, but you can also access military records using Soldiers and Sailors database. It's a free site. So I specialize in free sites first because it can become very expensive, researching families. And so you try to save money anywhere. And so here are some other sites that you may be able to use. Now, the one thing I said that, you need to do is one, talk to your relatives, but don't just call them up and say, I'm getting ready to do my research. Now you need to tell me who your mother was, who your father was, and all that. If you don't have a relationship with them first, you're not going to get the information. You might get, people may hang up on you, or they may freeze up. And then there are all those family secrets that they may not want to tell you. And so, you have to work with your family. I one time announced to my family, I said, well, I'm getting ready to do everybody's research. I surely would appreciate it if you would all just come and tell me and save me some time so I don't have to, find it out. Well, half of the family said, came and confessed. The other half froze up. So you have to build relationships with people before you start down this journey. I want to thank you all for allowing us to come into your community and just give you a glimpse of your families. And so we really appreciate this, and I have certainly enjoyed being here in Washington County to help just give a brief insight into your family. One thing about genealogy is, once you get bit, it's hard. There's no cure. I'm sorry. You just keep on keeping on. And there's always that next adventure. And so I thank you very much on your journey to find your ancestors. Thank you. We, the families were chosen, and the question was, how do we choose the families? We took the recommendation of the local historians in our community, and that's Dr. Henderson and Cheryl, I forget your last name. Devera. They helped us identify those individuals who might be interested in learning a little bit more about their families. So we took the recommendation of our local historians and genealogists to do that.
So we had a question about prison records. So what about jail or prison records? I have a cousin that did time in prison in Texas that was falsely accused, and I'm interested in finding out. Do you have any tips for that?
So the person is interested in prison records and how to find out more information about that. So start first with that free site, Family Search. Type in that name, and the Family Search does have prison records online. The person might also search if they know the approximate time that the person was incarcerated. They can also search newspapers, and you can also use your courthouse, because the courthouse many times has those records if you know the approximate time. So that's the way I would, try to approach that. That would be the first steps I would take.
Great, thank you. Someone is asking about DNA research, and they're having trouble getting a good sample. Do you have any experience with DNA kits or any advice for getting a good background?
So getting a good sample, that's one thing I didn't really say in the thing. Okay, so my husband, when he took the DNA test, how many times did you have to take it? 3 times. He had to take it 3 times. He took the Ancestry DNA kit. And so one of the beautiful things about it is that you don't have to pay each time, that you mess up. So, if you mess up the first time, they're going to send you another kit, and at no charge. But normally it is mixing. I found it's the mixing of the fluids that create the issue. But sometimes they say it may be a medical condition, or one of the things it requires is you cannot eat 30 minutes before the test. And so, although that sounds like that's real easy to do, sometimes some people cheat. You know? So that could become an issue.
So if there are any more questions, feel free to add them to the chat. Do you all have any questions you'd like to ask? No? Okay, well, Dolores, you have lots of great jobs and thank yous in the chat as well. So I'll let you finish it up.
One of the things, like I said, I didn't mention this, but you know, if you have an opportunity to take a DNA test, use it. We gave kits to the families today. Find your oldest living relative and make sure they take the test. Because boy, do I wish I had given my grandmother a DNA test. Because you would not believe, like all of those 8 names that I was trying to figure out, all of those surnames and all of that, that can just open up a whole new avenue for finding relatives. Yes, sometimes there are some surprises, because right now I have a person who shows up as my first to second cousin, and nobody wants to claim this child. So we're on this journey to figure out who is this first to second cousin, because some kind of way we should know who that person is. But anyway, so you have to keep that in mind. But I do wish I had given my grandmother a DNA test. And so, you know, and she lived to be 94 years old. So, you know, so just think about that in order of priority. In order of priority, think about your oldest relatives and trying to get that person a DNA test. What's it? Okay, so it depends on what you're trying to find out. That's what I always tell people. What are you trying to find out? You know, male or female? It depends on the type of test you're taking. So there is what's called an autosomal test, and that test will show you both sides of your family, male and female. And then there are other tests in which it will focus either on your paternal or your maternal side. But I tell people, it doesn't matter. Just get the test, because that's normally what the problem is, that you don't have the data. One of the things that I got my uncle to take a test, and you know, he has 10 brothers. Okay, so of the 10 brothers, he was the only one willing to take this test. And so he took the test, and he was so excited. He took the ancestry test, and he was so excited about the fact that he found out that he was Nigerian. You know, that's what most people take the test about. But for me, they want to know what their ancestry was. But for me, what it found out, it opened up so many windows on locating family that I didn't know what happened to them. You know, all those years I had been researching, trying to find, you know, families. I found a connection to, you know, we were always told, yes, you have some New Orleans relatives, but I couldn't figure that out. And then I was told, I remember my paternal grandmother saying, I have lots of family in Galveston, lots of family. And of course, I knew my first cousins and all of that, but beyond that, I did not know. Well, DNA opened up that avenue. And I also found a ancestor that I had lost, a relative that I had lost track of as a young child. We had spent many summers with, but had lost track of it. It was through DNA that I was able to locate that person. So, it just depends. I would say it doesn't matter. Start with the oldest relative first, and because once that person's gone, you can't make those connections. And so, if you do a younger person, it's not going to take you as far back as you might want. So you want to get the oldest individuals first, and male or female, because once you have the DNA of one, you can, through analysis, identify which side, a maternal or paternal side of the family it is. That, I suggest people, if you're going to do that, take a workshop. There are plenty of them online that are free to understanding DNA.
Thank you. There's one comment here. Someone sounds like they've been doing some research, but they're getting stuck. Their grandmom has, they have a marriage record and a Prairie View textbook. I know she existed, but I don't see her in the census. Do you have any advice for when you get stuck like that? Or someone is there, but you can't find the documentation?
So, the person can't find the documentation, they're stuck, they know the birth date, so there are, I don't know if the person has utilized, Family Search or Ancestry to search for the individual. When you're searching for an individual using such a big database as that, you really need to be flexible in the information you enter into the search engine. So I would first say, go to Family Search, type in the name of the person, where you think the person lived, and just see what comes up. And then you're going to have to take the time to go through those documents. Also, you might just check your courthouse. Go down to the courthouse that that person resided in and see if they have that birth certificate online. And it depends on the state. Like in Louisiana, I think it's 100 years before you can review certain documents in that state. Right here in Washington County, you can go online. Birth certificates, death certificates are online today. So check your courthouse, go and find that local genealogy group, because all of them have what they call brick wall sessions that help people break through brick walls. There are also online genealogy groups that are doing surname researches that may be able to help that individual locate that relative.
If there's any more questions, again, put them in the chat. Any of you guys?
I have the researchers here. Are there any family members that might have questions from any of the researchers? I know you haven't had an opportunity to review all of the information they provided, but if anybody has any questions of those, I know that we talked about it and they're all prepared to answer any questions that you might have. Any? Kathleen here with the Mays family. Welcome, Kathleen. Yeah, I saw her come in earlier. Yes. Yes. Yeah, she's referring to the handout, which I think we put in the chat box for those online, that handout. And there are a lot of, let me say this, there are a lot of genealogy groups online that will help you with your brick walls. And so, one group, of course, we have with the AUG chapter in Houston, we have what's called the AUG surname group. And you can go to that it's a Facebook page. Everybody's not into Facebook, but a Facebook page that can also help you work through brick walls. But I can't overemphasize going to your local libraries and your local genealogy groups. Join those because they are a wealth of information that can help you work through. And it's nothing like collaborating because research is much easier if you're doing it together in groups and not in isolation.
Okay, well, there are no more questions here on the chat. Oh, one more in here in the audience. Go ahead, yeah.
Hi, my dad is from.
So approximately when did he die? I mean, when was he born? 1818. 1818. 19. Oh, I was gonna say that was before Texas, and I can't help you on that one. 1918. Okay, so there are mortality schedules that might help you. There are so did he die at birth? You don't know. So not a record of his brother, the twin. And so you've searched census records? Okay. Yeah. So if he was born in 1918, so start with the 1920 census. See if he's in there, if they list him in there. And if he's not in that census record, if he didn't die, it depends on when he might have died. So let's say the person died between the 1920 and the 1930 census, I would check the cemeteries. Then you can check that by just going to Find a Grave, which is a free website. I type in his name on Find a Grave, see if you can locate it that way. Did your family have a family cemetery anywhere where most of your family was buried? Yeah, I would on Find a Grave, I would search there to see if there's any record of him there. But I would certainly, if you have not used a family search online to search for the individual, I would do that, because that would give you access to a lot of records. By just putting in, you can put in both names and they will probably. Now, remember, for me, what has been very successful in using that particular search engine is start with the name, the basic name that you remember or that you believe is correct. And I would put in Washington County. And you could put in the year and then see what results you get. Okay? Don't try to put in middle name and all of that, because you want to be get more possibilities. Because if you narrow it down, things like spelling, misspellings in records and that kind of thing can trip you up if you put too much information in there. So start with that person's name, first name, surname, county. Look at that, and then go back and put in their birthday and see if any information comes up. Search by the parents' names too. Also search by the parents' names, because many times in these documents, when you search by the parents' names, their children come up, their death certificates for their children come up. So if you know the parents' names, use those names. So that's my suggestion. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. Any other questions, comments? Yes?
I just wanted to say, this has been wonderful and very enlightening. I'm so happy that my husband invited me to come along with him today. I did have a question regarding the DNA repository for African Americans. I know there is one DNA sort of testing kit.
Mm-hmm.
Is it usable?
So I had an, are you talking about African ancestry? Okay. Yeah. I had an opportunity being, I went to a meeting of the Afro-American Genealogy Society about, I'm going to say it's probably been more than 10 years ago. And Dr. Kittles, who first developed that test, he was giving away free tests and I won one. That's how I found out that part of my ancestry was Hassa Fulani in northern Nigeria. The thing about his test is this, is that it only traces one line of your family. So one line. So the one line that was traced was my maternal line. The difference between 23andMe and Ancestry is that it tests multiple lines because of the type of test that's being performed. And so it depends on what you're researching, so if you're concentrating and the line you want to concentrate on, maybe that one might help you. And so, you really need to study up a little bit on each of the different types of tests. But for me, the most beneficial has been 23andMe and Ancestry, and for a couple of reasons. Not that I particularly like the companies. They have different pluses and minuses, but they have the largest databases. So if you're looking for family, then I would select one of those because you would be more likely to find them. If you're just trying to trace whether you came from a particular country in Africa, your origin, on a continent, or, it could be Europe, it could be South America or whatever, then that would not be, at this point, if you're a beginner, very beneficial for researching, your ancestry from the standpoint of who were my ancestors. and where do they live and that kind of thing. It might ultimately help you. I know people who, there's a librarian at Clayton Library who was able to identify through the test a living ancestor that had a DNA connection to him. So it depends on what you're seeking. But for me, Ancestry and 23andMe has been most beneficial in trying to connect the ties, especially identify the surnames that are connected to my family and how they're connected. And, you know, filling out my family tree. Because your family tree is never finished, unfortunately. I have to tell you that. You're always going to be constantly searching, and, you know, and it will improve over time.
Anything else? There was one person here that commented in relation to that question that 23andMe gave away lots of kits to Native Africans a few years ago. So they have a lot of Native African DNA. So there you go.
But I know that African ancestry one does too. They did extensive studies and all of that. But
Someone's asking about the photo. What are the small umbrellas and what do they represent?
that's the Shake Snyder family. That is their roots are in New Orleans, and so that's Mardi Gras, a Mardi Gras theme. That was their family reunion, and it used the Mardi Gras theme. Yes, the second line dance, parasols. Yes. And they had one, they had a second line. This is a big family of Shake Snyders. I remember meeting a guy, one of my husband's relatives said that. I thought he was living in somewhere in Michigan or somewhere like that up north. He said, I thought I was the only Shake Snyder, and then he came to New Orleans and those Shake Snyders were shaking everywhere. They were shaking. And this particular family, that's what that's about. This particular family, yeah, they call themselves the German chocolate Shake Snyders.
So were the out of the group that you
Oh, there were, I think we found, yeah, I think there were at least 25 different versions of how to spell Shake Snyder. Yeah, and even in this group, that people had variations in how they spelled it. It took me a long time to figure out how to spell Shake Snyder, but you know, I finally learned. Yes, in this group, they use different variations. So remember that, folks, you know, people, you know, the census takers, they spelled the names the way they heard them. And so when you're looking for them, you know, just think about that. You may have to misspell your ancestor's name in order to find it, because the census takers, you know, many people weren't literate. They didn't read or write. They didn't know what the census taker wrote down, you know, and they didn't verify that information. So it could be incorrect. I know, like in here, there's a gentleman, K-O-S-S-E, K-O-S-S-I-E, K-O-S, I mean, different spellings in the records, you know, and so you just have to remember that mistakes can be made in records. And so it just depends on who's giving the information at the time and who wrote it down. So.
We have another question here about name changes. Any information on how former enslaved individuals decided what they would change their last name to? My family was in New Orleans at the end of the Civil War and changed the last name from the former enslaver's name to another. but we do not know what may have been the most influential reasons for choosing a certain name.
So after slavery, there were different reasons that people chose names. I was helping a friend research his family, and basically after the Civil War, and plus this came through family stories, okay, passed down, that after emancipation, he decided that his name would now be Newman, new man. So some people just selected a new name. Some people took the name not of their most recent slave owner, but one prior to that, or one they preferred over another. Some selected it because they wanted a connection to a family member that may have been displaced during slavery. So there are multiple reasons, why people change their names. And so it's kind of hard many times if there are no family stories as to why. I can give you one. In my family, I always thought my family's surname was Butler. But lo and behold, I found out in my research that when they came to Texas from Georgia, the name was Brutal and not Butler. So for many years, I was searching for Butler, and I couldn't figure out why can I not find these individuals before. I think I was stuck at 1930. I couldn't find them anymore. They changed their name from Brutal to Butler. And so the reason I don't really know, I do know we had a family history that in finding a cousin that I found on DNA, located him that way, his grandmother had her story, legend of how that happened. She said her name was always Brutal when she came, and that her grandfather decided that he wanted to name it after a local gentleman named Butler. So the name was changed from Brutal to Butler. So think about if all that time, that's why you have to keep your mind open. All that time I had been searching for Butler and couldn't figure out, here are these people in Navarro County. I should be able to figure out where they went. I searched every record in Navarro County, for certain years. And when I saw the name Brutal, when I learned of that, it just opened up all the other records and took me beyond 1870. So you do have to collaborate and work with your family members because they have stories to tell that can connect you, to your relatives and those things. But the names, there are multiple reasons as to why, people chose names. And so, some of them are random and some of them are not, but, some of them are related to their family stories and what was important. Found out.
They were white and black.
Well, okay, so the family story is that the first Shake Snyder came to Louisiana from where? Brussels. Okay, and so there's one story that I will tell. The gentleman that runs, and you'll have to help me with that Sunday, the Laurel Plantation. He's a assistant curator of the Laurel Plantation in Louisiana. And he is what we call the white Shake Snyder. And then you have the German chocolate Shake Snyders. And he is very open about his family history and how, that family came to Louisiana, New Orleans, and all that area. And so we have one relative in that family line, and she's a researcher, has been researching for a long time. She came to New Orleans to meet Jay Shake Snyder. And so he referred her to his sister. And his sister said, I don't know why Jay keeps sending these people to me. I don't want to talk, to them. So you can find both. You can find people who are open and willing to figure out and share the family history. And then you're going to find others who don't want to have anything to do with it.
All right, well, we are nearing the end of our time here for our webinar. But I'm sure those of you that are here, feel free to keep talking. Otherwise, I'll just finish this up here and let all of you know on the webinar that this presentation will be recorded and shared on the Texas Historical Commission YouTube page. We have included the handout in the chat, so hopefully you were able to grab that. And I just want to say a big thank you to Dolores for this wonderful presentation. You are so knowledgeable. Yeah. So we really appreciate this, and thank you all for joining us.